The late George Whitaker Sr., seen here with his wife, was a lifetime employee with Ford and held a managerial position at the Rouge plant. He went to work on the morning of November 25th to be confronted by an amazing sight.
He was astonished when he went to the B building where garage existed at that time, and he saw the Kennedy limousine that John F. Kennedy had been murdered in. The interior of the limousine had completely been stripped, and the windshield was not in the limousine. He went to the glass lab where he was in charge of laminating glass, and the glass lab door was locked. He knocked on the door, and it was open, and two of his subordinates were in there with the windshield that had been removed from the vehicle. They were under orders to take that windshield and use it as a template in making a new windshield. But what fascinated him, and which he discussed with his family and no one else until he spoke with me, was that he saw a hole in the windshield.
It was a good, clean bullet hole right straight through in the front. Right, this had a clean round hole in the front and fragments on the front of that.
Mr. Whitaker had 30 years of experience working with glass and had seen many tests performed on glass, including tests performed with firearms. He described that hole as being in the same location that Charles Taylor Jr. of the Secret Service had described the hole in his report. And of course, without knowing that anybody had observed it before then, but he also was absolutely 100% convinced that that shot had to emanate from the front of the Kennedy limousine, thus indicating that a shot had been fired from the front, to his mind, to 100% certainty. I asked him what had happened to the original windshield. His answer to me was, "We scrapped it." I said, "You destroyed it?" And he says, "That's right. Our orders were to scrap that windshield."
After George Whitaker died in 2001, this statement was found amongst his possessions, reaffirming for future generations exactly what he had told Doug Weldon 8 years previously.
This document was discovered, and for me, it gave the final stamp of approval that what he told me on that August day in 1993 was in fact the truth of what really happened.
One of the assassination's most significant smoking guns, indicating both a conspiracy and a cover-up, is kept here. Kennedy's original autopsy photographs, taken at Bethesda Hospital on the night of his death, have always been used to support the lone gunman theory.
I've looked at these autopsy photographs at the National Archives on many occasions now. I've actually been there on 9 separate visits. When the photographs of the back of the head at the autopsy were shown to 16 Parkland doctors, all 16 said they did not recognize that photograph as what they had seen in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital. How many people did recognize it? 0. When I went to the archives to look at these photographs of the back of the head, there's a pair of photographs, so I used the stereo viewer. And what I saw was really quite shocking. This whole area of hair on the back of the head, with the hair standing up, looked as if it had been glued in one particular plane in space. It was two-dimensional, whereas the rest of the photograph is three-dimensional. And the 3D effect occurs for virtually all the other pairs of photographs, so this was unique. The back of the head, this area, and the hair sticking up here looked as though it was simply two-dimensional, as if it had been glued into one position in space, in one plane. It was the most bizarre. What does that mean? Photographic forgery. We get a 3D effect for all the image except for the place where it's exactly the same because it's been dubbed in. So they took out basically the part where the hole was, and instead they used a soft matte insert to put in the same image on each of these photos of the back of the head so that it would look like there was no damage back here. If there's a big hole at the right rear of the head, that means a shot from the front. That can't be Oswald. So the conspirators were hard-pressed at this point. They had to get rid of that big hole at the back of the head, or it would have clearly shown shots from the front and no possibility of a lone gunman.
Remarkable testimony regarding the autopsy photographs comes for the first time from veteran World War II photographer Joe O'Donnell. He worked for the State Department and then the U.S. Information Agency for a total of 23 years, serving with distinction under 6 presidents. He was devastated by Kennedy's death.
He was a fine man, he really was. And I hate to say it, but I really loved him. I really did. Wonderful person.
A close colleague of Joe's for many years was the late Robert Knudsen, a Navy photographer who was permanently attached to the White House.
He didn't have many friends, not in the press. They were envious of him. But he was a very nice fellow. We always got along great.
On the night of Kennedy's assassination, Robert Knudsen never came home. He returned to his family 3 days later, deeply disturbed. He told them he had taken many photographs of the president's body in the morgue at Bethesda, and that it was the hardest assignment he'd ever had. He said the Secret Service had controlled all of the film.
A few days after the assassination, I was at the White House in the press room, and Knudsen came to me, and he said, Joe, I have something I want to show you. So I went back to his sort of a work room, and he pulled out an envelope and showed me about 12 pictures, 5 by 7, and had all these pictures of the president on his stomach and on his back, and could see the hole here, about 3/8 of an inch, and the back of his head above the line, big hole about the size of a grapefruit. And then a couple days later, maybe a day later, he said, Joe, have a minute? And I said, sure. He said, I want to show you something. Those pictures I showed you the other day, these are the same ones, but a little different. And I said, what do you mean? He said, let me show you. He got the first one out, and I said, no hole. He said, no, they covered it up. And I looked in the back. The hole was neatly covered up. And I said, who did that? He said, well, I didn't do it. I said, well, I'm not saying you did, but I'm surprised.
There is no record of Robert Knudsen attending Kennedy's autopsy, yet he had photographs in his possession that had clearly been altered to disguise a shot from the front.
These photographs were always in the control of the Secret Service. So whoever changed this, whoever modified it, either had to be in the government or had to have the approval of the government to do this. We certainly can't imagine the Mafia, for example, doing this, or the Soviets. There's just no way. It had to be someone with government approval.
The government continues to be haunted by the discrepancy between the wounds the autopsy photographs show and what the Dallas doctors actually saw.
In the late 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations looked at the evidence of the Kennedy assassination, and one of the most disturbing things about that evidence when they looked at it was the fact that there were a team of doctors where Kennedy had been taken right after he was shot in Dallas. These are Dallas doctors who were experienced in trauma who had said he had a hole in the back of his head. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was trying to say that Oswald had done it, and with a hole in the back of the head, if you're being shot in the back and the bullet blowing out in front, that doesn't fit. So the House Select Committee reported that it had refuted the Dallas doctors. The Dallas doctors all got it wrong because they had better witnesses. Their witnesses were the witnesses that were there in the morgue during the autopsy. And they said that 26 witnesses that they'd interviewed all endorsed the autopsy photographs showing the head wound up here. None of them agreed that there was a wound back here.
There is no medical evidence that President Kennedy was hit from the front and to the right.
But they didn't let us see the interviews. They didn't let us see the documents that these people had prepared. In fact, they were scheduled to have been suppressed until 2028. When the documents tumbled out in the mid-1990s, lo and behold, the autopsy witnesses, who the House Select Committee had interviewed, said the same thing the Dallas doctors did. the hole in the head was back here. They drew diagrams showing a hole in the head back here or back here, and it became very apparent that the House Select Committee had just interviewed these people, suppressed their testimonies, and then misrepresented them in their report.
The forensic pathological panel simply says that if he was shot out from the front and to the right, the shot missed.
The doctors who were supposed to evaluate the medical evidence for the House Select Committee assassinations never saw these suppressed interviews where not only were the Dallas doctors saying there's a hole in the back of the head here, but so were the morgue witnesses saying there was a hole in the back of the head. So it was a complete abomination. It was perhaps the most dishonest thing that was ever done, and it was apparently done to keep Oswald as the central figure in this scenario.
As the cover-up of Kennedy's murder slowly unravels and the true picture unfolds, new smoking guns are revealed. This is the Field of Honor in Restland Cemetery, Dallas, and the burial site of a professional mortician laid to rest here by his colleagues on February 17, 1974. This plaque marks the life of a mysterious man whose links to the Kennedy assassination are only just beginning to emerge. His name was John Liggett. He is remembered as a highly skilled embalmer by a former friend and co-worker, Charles Smith.
If he'd have to build a lip or a nose or build an eye orbit or ear, he may work all night long doing the reconstructive work on someone that had been maybe shot in the face or an automobile accident. He was the best. He would tell you he was the best. And when he finished it, he wanted the family to tell him he was the best.
Popular with his colleagues, he also had a secret life.
There'd be days when John would call and say, I need to miss tonight, or I'm not going to be there. Or this happened quite a bit, that John was, we didn't know where John was, and I don't know that management knew where he was. He would just call in and say, I need off. Never discussed where he was, and we didn't ask. A lot of fellow workers would wonder, why can he be gone 2 or 3 weeks, come right back in so easy? And we felt like if we were gone for 2 or 3 weeks, so there's no use to coming back.
In a small town in Oklahoma, far from the rhythms of the big city, John Liggett is remembered by a former wife. Lois married him in Dallas after a whirlwind romance only 3 months before Kennedy's assassination.
John was a very charming person, and I found him to be very attentive and considerate and very, very sweet to me. I loved him. I fell in love with him.
John came into our lives less than a year after our own father, Charles Godwin, had been killed in a private plane crash. And John was not real welcome by my 2 older sisters and my brother and myself. We were a family, and he had a ready-made cover, and that's what I've always thought, is that we were a convenient cover for a man who needed that.
On the day of the assassination, John was with Lois at Restland, attending the funeral service of her late aunt. He was suddenly called from the graveside.
John went to the office and came back very shortly and explained to me that the President of the United States had been shot and that he was called to go to Parkland Hospital. I went home after the funeral, and it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and John called me from Parkland. I could hear the confusion in the background, and I asked him what was going on. He said, the president has died. And I said, well, did Restland get the job? And he said, no, some other funeral home got the job. But he said, I've got a lot of work to do. Don't try to call me. I'll call you as soon as I can. And it was about 24 hours before I heard from him. He came home and he walked in the door, and when I saw him, he physically looked like he had really been through a very traumatic experience. His clothes were disarrayed, and that was so out of character for him.
He was obviously tired, very exhausted, but agitated and hyped, and informed my mother that we would be leaving town, that we had to get out of town.
I said, where are we going? And he said, we're going to get out of town for a while until all of this blows over. And that was a quote, because I thought, well, what blows over?
A high-speed journey south took the perplexed family firstly to Austin and then San Antonio. John made brief stops en route to have huddled conversations with various contacts.
Throughout this journey, there were conversations that went on between John and his relatives and friends that I did not feel like I was privy to. That they knew something I didn't know, and I didn't understand what was going on.
In the early hours of Sunday morning, November 24th, the family finally checked into a motel near Corpus Christi. John had a further meeting, this time with his elder brother, Malcolm.
Here again, they had conversations that made me feel like I didn't belong, that they knew something I didn't know. I don't know why we were there, but it seemed to be very important to John that we were there.
I do recall that every time I would see John in the room there, he was seated on the end of the bed, watching the television, and very intently watching the news, and chain smoking, because he did chain smoke. And was when John was nervous, he had a little bit of a nervous tick in his cheek, which I always knew that he was a little nervous there.
That's when he saw Oswald killed by Jack Ruby.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Harry Oswald has been shot.
The minute he saw that, he looked at me and said, everything's okay now, and you could just see his face. He was like all the pressure had been taken off of him.
All of a sudden he was like, sigh of relief, let's go, we can go home now. It was basically, pack your things, come on, we're leaving, now we can go.
We went back to Dallas, and everything went back to normal as everything could be under those conditions of the president's death.
But their lifestyle changed. After the assassination, John seemed to come into a lot of money. The family moved into a luxury home, and Liggett became a big-time gambler, hosting some of the wildest poker parties in Dallas.
The whole lifestyle from the moment John Kennedy was shot was just one chaotic thing after another. Either the police were involved in something he was doing, or his gambling was involved in something he was doing. It was just way over my head. The company he kept, the people, the pressure, it was just more than I could take.
There was an occasion that my sister, Benny, and my mother both recall of a visit from one of John's rather eccentric friends from New Orleans. And he was a rather freakish character, and my sister claims that we made merciless fun of him, the kids, my brother, my sisters, because he was rather odd with the painted-on eyebrows and the wig. He was a rather freakish man. John said to us that this was a friend of his from the Civil Air Patrol, that they had been in Civil Air Patrol together. And we believe this was David Ferrie.
David Ferrie was a prime suspect in the 1967 Garrison investigation into Kennedy's assassination. He was found dead in his New Orleans apartment before he could be interrogated.
I really believe that John Liggett was somehow involved in the John F. Kennedy assassination. I think his role was to do something with the body. To the body, how alter it, fix it, I have no idea. Now, he may have even gone with it to Bethesda. He had plenty of time to do that. I think his job was to do something with that body of John F. Kennedy.
Liggett's lifestyle led Lois to divorce him in 1966. They both remarried but remained close. In 1974, out of the blue, Liggett was arrested for attempted murder. This Dallas home was the scene of a vicious crime. Dorothy Peck, a friend of John Liggett's, suffered horrendous injuries and was left for dead, but survived to identify Liggett as her assailant. The police were swiftly linking him with other brutal killings in the Dallas area. He was imprisoned in the county jail, but the police were not allowed to interrogate him. John had been held on remand for almost a year when his brother Malcolm insisted on meeting Lois in a park in Austin.
He was very secretive about this meeting, and he wanted to walk. He wouldn't talk to me in my car. And he told me at that time not to have any further contact with John, that it would be in my best interest not to. In fact, he said, if you care anything at all about your children or yourself, you will not see him or correspond with him anymore. And I think that Malcolm felt that if I talked to John, John would tell me something that either Malcolm or someone Malcolm knows didn't want John to tell me. And I really believed that. I was so frightened by this action that I moved to Lubbock, Texas. And a few weeks later, I had a phone call from a friend there who told me that John had been shot in the back and was dead.
On the morning of February the 14th, 1975, Liggett was being transferred with other prisoners from the courthouse in downtown Dallas to the nearby county jail. The police vehicle had entered the garage when Liggett, using a hidden key, slipped out of his handcuffs and made a bid for freedom. A single shot in the back, fired by a sheriff's deputy, killed him instantly.
I feel like Malcolm knew that there was something that was going to happen. I feel that he knew more than he was saying to me. And it frightened me for myself and for my children.
But the mysteries do not end with Liggett's death. In 1992, Deborah, for the first time, met Leona, John's wife at the time he died. Although reluctant to talk, Leona recounted a visit to Restland to view Liggett's body prior to burial.
She came out from East Texas to Dallas, and she was shocked and surprised because to her, this was not John. It wasn't John there. She said that the person that was in the casket that she was shown had a mustache, and this to her was also an indication this was not John, and I too would have to think not, because John never, as long as I'd known him for the many, many years, could even grow a mustache. I did get the distinct impression that Leona was very nervous, even at that time in 1992, to speak with me about the details of John's death and her suspicions that it was not John that was buried there, and probably rightly so. I think I would be very nervous to know that as well, and I think I am.
John's brother Malcolm handled the funeral that took place 3 days after the shooting. John's former colleague Charles Smith was there.
There's no doubt the person that we handled the funeral for, the person that we embalmed, the person that I helped dress and we put in the casket and handled the funeral service for, that was John Melvin Liggett. That was a John Liggett that we knew for several years prior to this incident happening.
But the story does not end there. After his divorce from Lois, John worked in Las Vegas for 3 years as a dealer. He had close contacts there. Recently, Lois was on vacation in Vegas with her grandchildren when she had the most extraordinary experience.
We were in a casino, and I saw someone that looked exactly like John Liggett. And he turned around and looked at me and heard me call one of my grandchildren's names. And when I did, he looked at her, and he looked back toward one of the people that worked with him, turning his back to me, and said something to him about me because he pointed back of himself toward me. But we didn't stay around to find out if that was John or not. I was pretty shaken by it. I really felt like from the back of his head, and when he turned around and faced me, I thought it was John Liggett. So it wouldn't surprise me a bit in the world if he were in Vegas. In fact, that's the most logical place I can think of that he would be.
Lois and Deborah's suspicions about John Liggett's ties to the assassination are reinforced by a photograph that has emerged in recent times. It was taken at Jack Ruby's Dallas nightclub, The Carousel, prior to the assassination and Ruby's shooting of Oswald.
Obviously, one would recognize Jack Ruby. Immediately to his right is John Liggett's brother, Malcolm Liggett. His wife, Suzanne, the blonde, to his right. We met her several occasions that she was at our home. The last I recall seeing Malcolm Liggett was at my mother's residence in Dallas, and this was at the time that John was still in jail in Dallas. The woman with the dark hair and the black dress in the center of the photograph is Iris Campbell. Not at the time of this photograph, but years later, my mother met Iris when they were living in West Texas, out in Lubbock. My mother was a member of the Episcopal Church, St. Paul's, there in Lubbock. And Iris came in one day and had expressed an interest in becoming an Episcopalian and joining the church. And she and my mother became very dear friends, and later also became my daughter's godmother. For a few years there, she was in and out, in close contact with my mother, came and visited frequently, and then disappeared, basically just disappeared. And I've not seen Iris Campbell, and neither has my mother, for many, many years. She just kind of faded out. Prior to seeing this photograph, I was unaware of any connection between the people that I do know and Jack Ruby. And it does put them in context then as acquaintances of Jack Ruby's.
I really think that maybe John had something to do with government business. I really believe his death had something to do with the John F. Kennedy connection. What exactly, I don't know, but I believe it.
Much may still remain obscure, and many questions wait an answer. But as more and more courageous Americans speak out, the smoke begins to clear, revealing the hidden truth that lies behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
You have been listening to a bonus episode for Killing Jack. Remember, this is the Experiment Club, and we're on and on with the truth and revelations. You have to step into the darkness in order to see the light. God bless you, and continue to help us and support us in our podcast. I do need a new handicap van, at least newer than 20 years old. So support our podcast. We are trying to continue and